Hitler had chosen Nuremberg for his big rallies of the National Socialist Party Congress. The city was still in ruins, flattened by the bombardments, but in the still intact law courts was to take place the trial by the Allied powers of the principal leaders of the Third Reich. It was rich in symbolism.
The Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, Germany, once the holy city of Nazism, becomes the setting of an epic event. Here, under the vigilant eyes of Allied military police, the 20 most important surviving members of the Hitler gang go on trial. The attention of all the world is centered on this city and this scene.
After the war, the Allies went after the most prominent Nazi leaders for the international trial.
But this trail gave a very narrow view of things. It focused on the men in charge and ignored the ones who carried out their orders. That's what the Germans wanted at the time.
For the victorious Allies, the process at Nuremberg was to symbolically re-establish the rule of law.
Of course, the question remained, who do they judge? Who are the guilty ones? If so many people were involved, who was actually guilty? They chose the easiest answer, to charge those at the head of the regime. So they brought the 24 most important figures to trial, except the leader of them all, Hitler.
The trial addressed the killing of the Jews, but no mention of the Holocaust.
We still hadn't understood that the total destruction of the Jewish people was at the heart of the regime. We saw it as just another of the horrors committed by the Nazis.
The final solution, the mass murder of the Jews, is simply one among a number of items that are lumped together and is not separated out as being particularly distinct.
As a result, the number of eyewitnesses who were actually victims of the Nazi regime were somewhat limited at Nuremberg.
There were very few Jewish witnesses. Any who wished to talk for longer weren't allowed to, because the Holocaust wasn't the subject of the trial. So it wasn't spoken of. It was forgotten.
Rudolf Höss was commandant of the Auschwitz camp from May 1940 to November 1943. He was arrested in the British zone and transferred to Nuremberg, where he appeared as a witness.
1940 bis 1943 Lagerkommandant von Auschwitz. Und in dieser Zeit sind Hunderttausende von Menschen dort in den Tod geschickt worden. Ist das richtig? Jawohl. Ist es weiter richtig, dass Ihnen Eichmann erklärte, insgesamt seien in Auschwitz über 2 Millionen jüdische Menschen vernichtet worden?
So richtig. Im Sommer 1941 wurde ich persönlichen Befehlsempfang zum Reichsführer SS Himmler nach Berlin befohlen. Dieser sagte mir dem Sinne nach, der Führer hat die Endlösung der Judenfrage befohlen. Wir, die SS, haben diesen Befehl durchzuführen.
What Höss said was noted, but it didn't particularly arouse any curiosity among the prosecutors or the judges. No doubt because no one in the dock was directly being accused of organizing the extermination of the Jews. The main culprits, Himmler, Hitler and Heydrich, were all dead. So that wasn't the point of the trial.
No chances were being taken at Nuremberg as the hour of verdicts and sentences approached.
The case of humanity versus 21 leaders of German National Socialism. Now it is ended, after the speaking of 5 million words. Ended after a chronicle of horror such as the world has never heard, nor ever will again.
On the 30th of September 1946, 1 year after the court first sat, it pronounced 12 death sentences, 7 prison terms and 3 acquittals. On the 11th of October, all appeals were rejected. Those sentenced to death would all be hanged. On the 12th of October, they saw their families for the last time. Göring managed to commit suicide with a cyanide capsule his wife slipped him while kissing him goodbye. None of the accused expressed regret, with the exception of Hans Frank, who confessed that 1,000 years could pass and still Germany's guilt would not be erased.
Hans Frank had a bad attack of conscience at Nuremberg. Yeah. We should remember, he does not have any problem in crossing the line, crossing the Rubicon, from oppression, starvation, degradation, to physical annihilation. It's not a problem for Hans Frank. Later, he may have lost some sleep, but at the time, he didn't weep when 300,000 Jewish men, women, and children were sent from Warsaw to Treblinka. He was not upset about that.
At his hanging, Hans Frank expressed regret, converted to Catholicism, and submitted to his execution as atonement for the great errors he'd committed. He found faith and the confidence that there was a God to pardon him and accept him.
Teams of lawyers, most of them American, were busy preparing alongside the Nuremberg trial a second wave of hearings, 12 at first, then 13. Judge Telford Taylor was appointed leader of the prosecution of these trials.
The Americans conducted a second series of trials called the American Military Tribunals, and they had the trials of the top people in the justice, the top people in the foreign office, the top people involved in ethnic cleansing, the resettlement office, that were trying to show, in a sense, how pervasive the Nazi system was and how out of so many different areas of the professions people came.
I received a telegram from the Pentagon asking me to please come. I suppose my Harvard professor was consulted to join Telford Taylor, who has been assigned to have 12 additional trials, which would show the broad panorama of German society and help explain how it was that a civilized country like Germany could commit the type of atrocious crime. The first assignment that I had was go to Berlin and collect the evidence necessary to prove the guilt of all these categories of people. So I had a staff of about 50 people, and we combed through the Nazi offices, the Foreign Ministry, the SS, the Gestapo, whatever had not been bombed out, and even in the ruins of what had been bombed out, to find the evidence.
There was a massive destruction of the archives. Hundreds of kilos of testimonies and compromising documents were burned.
People were in a frenzy to try to burn the damaging records, to put them on fire and get rid of the evidence.
There was a special unit to burn everything that was left, so there wouldn't be too many testimonies.
The documentation about the final solution was destroyed at the end of the war. Eichmann destroyed many of the papers to protect himself.
But Allied armies simply moved too fast for the Germans to destroy all of the documentation. Large caches of documents in Berlin were evacuated in the countryside.
The Germans had all the Nazi Party files in a little house in the woods in Dahlem. From the air, it would look like any small villa, and it was deep in the woods. Underneath, subterranean blocks of files and archives were stored. Millions of Nazi Party files. So our researchers went down there, and when we had our defendants, they went right through these files and pulled them out. They were not destroyed because they were underground. Nobody could see them. One of my researchers showed me 3 or 4 big loose-leaf books, which were reports from the Eastern Front. And there, every day, the commanders of special units called Einsatzgruppen report how many Jews they had killed in which towns and categorize them, and the name of the commander and the name of the officer in charge. That's all I needed.
The centrally compiled reports compiled between 1941 and 1944, called the operations reports of the Einsatzgruppen, were discovered by Benjamin Ferencz.
I took a sample. I flew down to Nuremberg from Berlin, talked to General Taylor, and I said, we have to put on a new trial. And he said, we don't have staff. How can we put on a new trial? He said, can you do it in addition to your other work? I said, sure. He said, okay, you're it.
And Benjamin Ferencz became the chief prosecutor at the Einsatzgruppen trial.
I was a young man of 27. I was the chief prosecutor for the United States in one of the subsequent Nuremberg trials following the International Military Tribunal against Göring and company. I had no fear. I was not proud. They may have been amused to see this little guy come up there, you know, look like a little boy. I was only 5 feet tall, but I had the evidence in my hand, and I knew that evidence was overwhelming, and it was undisputable. It was their top secret reports in which they tabulated mass murder of innocent people. I was sure that they would be found guilty.
The prosecutors were concerned that eyewitness testimony might be challenged by the defense, particularly given the fact that some of the things that the Nazi regime had done were so unbelievable anyway. And they wanted to concentrate on convicting the defendants at the Nuremberg trials essentially through their own words, their own testimony, and the documents that they created.
The inquiry showed that many more people should have been charged, but there was a limit to how many they could bring to justice.
There were 24 seats originally for the International Military Tribunal for the same reason. This was only a sampling. No one thought we were going to try all those who are guilty of crimes. You would have hundreds of thousands of people who were mass murdered.
The ones who turned the Jews out of their houses and took them to the ghetto, weren't they part of the extermination? And the ones who guarded the ghetto and took the Jews to the burial pits to be killed, wasn't that part of the extermination?
These were educated people who were kind, I'm sure, to their cats and dogs. They were quite nice, you know, educated Germans. The list of my 6 SS generals among my defendants, most of the defendants have doctor's degrees. Before the trial of the Einsatzgruppen began, I was approached by one of the defense lawyers for a defendant by the name of Dr. Otto Rasch. And Dr. Rasch's lawyer said to me, you have to drop the case against Rasch. And I said, why? He said, he's suffering from Parkinson's disease. I said, what's Parkinson's disease? He said, well, he's shaking all the time. I said, if I killed so many people, I'd be shaking all the time too, because he did the Babi Yar job, 33,771 Jews killed in 2 days. So I said, is he breathing? He said, yes, he's breathing. I said, well, if he's breathing, I'm going to indict the son of a bitch. And he was. And when the time for the reading of the indictment, which is before the trial, came, they carried Russian American soldiers on 2 ends of a stretcher, wrapped in an army blanket. And the judge said, how do you plead to it? He said, not guilty. The indictment was closed. We were ready for trial.
The defendants Otto Rausch and Edward Strauss are absent.
Otto Rausch and Edward Strauss have been arraigned separately because on the opening day they were too ill to respond. But the record will show they now have been arraigned properly and in accordance with law.
But you can't trust men like him. Before the trial opened, he died. And we had to drop the case. And I go on to present the case.
We shall show that these deeds of men in uniform were the methodical execution of long-range plans to destroy ethnic, national, political, and religious groups which stood condemned in the Nazi mind. Genocide,
the extermination of whole categories of human beings was a foremost instrument of the Nazi doctrine.
I began my statement there against 22 mass murderers who had murdered over 1 million Jews in cold blood, including thousands of children, shot one at a time. My lead defendant, Dr. Otto Ohlendorf, who had a law degree and an economics degree, who was the father of 5 children, gave what I think was the best explanation of why they had committed these crimes and their mentality. And if you don't know the mentality of mass murderers, you'll never stop it.
Do you know how many persons were liquidated by Einsatzgruppe D under your direction?
Vom Juli 1941 bis Juni 1942 sind von den Einsatzkommandos etwa 90.000 als liquidiert gemeldet worden.
Will you explain to the tribunal why you believe that the type of execution ordered by you, namely military, was preferable to the shooting in the neck procedure adopted by the other Einsatzgruppen?
Auf der einen Seite sollte damit erreicht werden, dass die einzelnen Führer und Männer auf militärische Weise durch Befehl die Hinrichtung vollziehen konnten und daher keinen eigenen Entschluss zu fassen brauchten, sondern lediglich auf Befehl, auch äußerlich handelten. Zum anderen war mir bekannt, dass bei den Einzelhinrichtungen durch seelische Erregungen sich Misshandlungen nicht vermeiden ließen, da die Opfer zu früh von ihrer Hinrichtung erfuhren und daher nervenmäßig einer längeren Belastung nicht standhielten. Ebenso erschien es mir unerträglich, dass einzelne Führer und Männer diese Weise gezwungen wurden, in eigenem Entschluss eine große Zahl von Tötungen vorzunehmen.
He tried to present a more humane portrait of himself by noting that although some of the other commanders would use the infants and throw them up into the air and smash their head against a tree or shoot at them as target practice, he didn't want his men to do that. He said, let the mother hold the infant in her arms, and then she doesn't scream, and the baby is crying, and then aim for the infant. And then you can kill both of them, and you save ammunition, and it's a much better way to do.
When the Einsatzgruppen's former trigger pullers described these early executions, they were liable to say things like, well, they were very cruel, but not just for the victims. That's the sort of stuff you would hear.
Man who was involved in killing Jews by shooting them with revolvers in the head. And he said, yeah, we shot them. I walked into the pits, and I went there, and I gave them a mercy shot in the head. Boom, and to make sure they were dead. And boom, 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 boom. Ich musste hier waden in dem Blut. Und der Blut so bis hierhin. You know, I had to wade in the blood up to my knee almost of these Jews. Think what that was like. He says, können Sie sich vorstellen? Can you imagine? He was saying he was the victim. He's killing the Jews, but he had to wade in his blood. You know, get dirty. Could I imagine? I don't think he was showing remorse.
What they did, they wanted to do. The theory that they were under orders and were coerced into doing it is a lie.
The strategy of most people who were accused was to say, the decision was made over our heads. We weren't guilty. We were just following orders.
These men were saying that they could never have refused to kill, or they'd have been shot themselves. Naturally, no Nazi lawyer was able to prove that any Einsatzgruppen soldier had been shot for disobeying that order.
Did you receive reports from those who were working on the van.
Ich habe Meldung erhalten, dass die Einsatzkommandos die Wagen nur ungern benutzen.
Why not?
Weil die Beerdigung der Insassen für die Angehörigen der Einsatzkommandos eine starke Belastung war.
The Einsatzgruppen used gas vans and jammed and locked the door, and they had a pipe going from the exhaust into the van, and in about 20 minutes, everybody in the van was supposed to be dead. And Ollendorf explained sometimes they didn't work, and he didn't like the vans because they arrived at the pit where they were supposed to dump them like garbage, and people were still alive. Some of them were still alive. And the men had to unload them by hand. And he said, this was very hard on my men. So he was really a humanitarian at heart, was he trying to say. Those we put on trial, no one ever said, I am guilty. I never heard anybody say, I'm sorry. There was no remorse whatsoever on the part of any of the Germans that I met. On the day of sentencing, I was the first one in the courthouse. I sat at my table, the prosecutor's table. When the sentencing began, the courtroom was very quiet. Ollendorf had come up from the basement where the prison was to the courtroom.
Ollendorf est absolument sûr.
Ollendorf was sure he'd be condemned to death and executed. The guy did nothing to avoid the rope, nothing. He saw nothing to feel guilty about. He said, I was right to do it, and I'd do it again.
He put on the earphones and listened to the judge saying, for the crimes of which you have been convicted, this tribunal sentences you to death by hanging. Take off the earphones, step back, the door would close, boom, as though they had dropped into hell. But when the trial was over, I was sure he was going to hang. And being the father of 5 children, as he was, I thought, as a human thing, I should go down and talk to him. And so I went down to the death house, and I said, Herr Ollendorf, kann ich etwas für Sie tun? Can I do something for you? And he said, the Jews in America will suffer for what you have done. There was no remorse whatsoever. I just turned around, I said, goodbye, Mr. Ollendorf, and walked away. And the next thing I saw of him was a film of his being hanged by the neck, and in 8 minutes of hanging, he was dead. All of the defendants were convicted. 13 of them were sentenced to death. Only 4 were executed, and the rest of them, a few years later, were turned loose. There were 3,000 members of the Einsatzgruppen. Every day, they went out and shot Jews and others for no reason except their own ego and their own distorted theory of Aryanization and superiority. What happened to the 3,000 men? Nothing. Nothing. Was there justice done? What is justice? Talk about justice is really totally inadequate.
Ce procès finalement est passé, mais totalement.
In the end, the trial went unnoticed. It left no trace on people's memories, but it was the first ever trial to be about genocide.
The trials took a long time, and they were boring. The journalists lost interest, the people lost interest.
When the International Military Tribunal was on, the world press was there filming. It was very exciting. As soon as the trial was over, the press went home. They didn't care much about the subsequent proceedings. They had lost all of the glamour of Göring and some of the other well-known people who were in the dock.
Only the Americans wanted to continue the Nuremberg process. The French didn't want to, the Russians didn't want to, the British didn't want to. So the Americans mount a series of further trials trial of the Foreign Office officials, of the generals, of doctors.
And so a group of doctors were put on trial for performing medical experiments on concentration camp victims.
People at Buchenwald were even willingly infected by the doctors, and they all just cooperated.
Women, young Catholic women who had been selected by the German doctors and used for horrible experiments of various kinds, putting glass into their veins to see how long they take them to die or what you needed to heal them, freezing them, and all kinds of experiments.
The Höchst Company was deeply implicated in these crimes. And the worst is that the accused were all found not guilty at Nuremberg through lack of proof.
The focus of the trials was on the camps like Stutthof, Natzweiler, and Auschwitz. Very little investigation was made of hospitals and clinics within the Third Reich. But we now know that Jews were supplied by the camps to clinics all over Germany. The German doctors in hospitals and clinics were doing experiments on Jews in Berlin and Cologne and Hamburg. That these experiments were not confined to concentration camps like Dachau or Sachsenhausen, or the notorious experiments of Klauberg and Mengele in Auschwitz. Germany was covered with a network of research institutes at which German doctors were conducting experiments on human beings without their consent, usually followed by their murder.
The trial of the IG Farben industrial group was the 6th of the 12 war crimes trials pursued by the American authorities. IG Farben had obtained control of the BASF, Bayer and Agfa companies by financing out of Hitler's electoral campaign. They were fabricating chemical products, explosives, medications, photographic film, and above all, the Zyklon B used in the gas chambers of the extermination camps. These main factories, located in the camp at Buna-Monowitz, used the forced labor of tens of thousands of mostly Jewish prisoners hired from the Nazis from the Auschwitz camp only 7 kilometers away.
The managers at IG Farben were very efficient and all the time living normal family lives without a trace of remorse. And although it had been for a long time denied, they had children working there too. At the trial, IG Farben's role in these crimes was found to be very serious by the American judges. The Zyklon B came from the Degesh, the German company for the fight against parasites, a subsidiary of IG Farben. They were describing the death machine as if it was a bargain offer. So efficient and with excellent fine-tuning for even greater efficiency. Whereas what it did was massacre human beings. They talked about the new optimized process for disposing of the waste from these massacres. At the trial, people said that even if you didn't wish to see anything, you couldn't help smelling it. Apparently, there was a terrible smell. When you're constantly burning human bodies in ovens, it literally stinks. The smell is unbearable. The Attorney General's intention was to indict all 24 of the accused from IG Farben. They were charged with pillage, plunder, murder, and enslavement of civilians. But all were acquitted.
The judge in the court simply dismissed all of the eyewitness testimony by the survivors, and having dismissed all of the testimony as, quote, unreliable, then pronounced that given the benefit of the doubt to the accused,
the judges regarded them as white-collar criminals that the crimes committed by company employees weren't comparable to those of the Einsatzgruppen.
Was just what a horrific miscarriage of justice it was. They have almost no luck trying to charge anybody who's in industry, and unless the evidence is so overwhelming, nobody else gets dragged in. After that, there are no trials of industrialists.
It was old news. No one was interested any longer.
There wasn't going to be a second international military tribunal. Things between the Soviets and the Allies were becoming tense already.
A new enemy exists, the Russians. And we have to get on well with the Germans. So it's no longer politically expedient to expose Nazi crimes.
Aus Stahlhelmen werden Siebe für den Haushalt. Die Waffenschmieden der Welt produzieren nicht mehr das, was die Menschheit fürchtet, sondern das, was sie braucht.
Denazification, although I believe it began with the best of intentions and the best motivations, again, it was a victim of the Cold War.
And then rapidly they backed off because the Cold War was more important to them than denazification.
In many ways, denazification was a farce. When German justice tried to bring people to account for these crimes, there were very few of them found guilty.
There's immense pressure to commute those sentences and to let those people go.
They were almost all freed. Only a few who got heavy sentences, like Speer or Hess, actually stayed in prison. The rest were all let go.
All the major criminals who weren't arrested in 44 or 45 lived free and unpunished. They went back to their old jobs.
Thousands of individuals slipped through the net. The Cold War was beginning. There were many factors. And then society had to carry on existing too. There had to be structures and someone had to run them.
And the men who had the know-how, mostly, all had the same profile. They were 40, they were lawyers, they had to have a bit of experience. In fact, they'd been administrators of the Third Reich.
They nearly all got new careers, sometimes very nice ones.
After the war, there were former Nazis in the German administration, all the way up to responsible ministerial posts.
Almost everyone very soon became blind to the implications of these people still being in the system and to the crimes they'd committed.
I think above all, people wanted to draw a line under it all and not talk about it anymore.
When the trials were over, I was approached by a consortium of Jewish organizations. Said, you have to do something, trying some minimal compensation for the victims. They have nothing. I was negotiating with the German companies to try to get compensation for the surviving victims of the concentration camps for slave labor. They hadn't paid them.
It clearly had to be recognized that these people had been forced to work in the ghetto, that it was work that directly profited big business or the German state, and that they had at least to be compensated for that.
The state itself paid up. But the businesses and factories that had made money from the Jews never paid anything.
The IG Farben people with whom I was negotiating said, no, we don't know how many Jews there were, blah, 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 blah. It was a mission impossible. And they finally agreed to pay a relatively small sum of money to settle the matter and get it out of the way.
Some who escaped never got what they were due. And there were several groups who weren't taken into account.
Said they're only responsible for things that happened inside Germany or in camps which they controlled. What was in the Soviet zone, out. We had no responsibility for that.
The insurance companies ducked out of paying and dragged things out until people were dead, saying nothing's really been proved yet.
What a pity. The Germans didn't want to recognize that they were responsible for this. Shame on them. What about compensation for the individual survivors? What about those who had lost their parents and their children? You cannot measure the value of a human life. And we refuse to do that. But we will divide into categories. Severely injured, 25,000 marks. Less severely, 15,000. Minimum injury, 10,000. But you couldn't value pain and suffering, and you couldn't value fear. And the attempt to put this into a straitjacket, like an insurance claim, created a very difficult and almost bizarre atmosphere.
When it was time to decide on compensation and calculate amounts, which with hindsight just seems macabre, it was very difficult indeed.
Various groups in Israel felt that it would be betrayal of Jewish honor to ask from the murderers compensation for their parents or their children. And it was highly emotional.
A lot of people said you shouldn't touch the money, it was tainted, that you shouldn't accept it because it was impossible to make amends. But others said, it's our parents' money, our brothers. We need it to give clothes and housing to the survivors. It was one of the most heartbreaking debates Israel has ever had.
Even after the agreement was signed, some people in Israel rejected it and refused to take the money. They considered it blood money, stained with the blood of the victims.
I think the word reparation was unfortunate. They should take it out of the dictionary. Reparation means forgiveness. What reparation? They should have put it another way, like restoring stolen Jewish property, but not reparation.
A stunning photograph. It's an iconic photograph, if you will. I mean, a group of peasants standing together, and there is something in front of them. And a photograph that someone who lived through the communist period, for example, would have seen 1,000 times, because every year when the harvest time would come, you know, there would be photographs in communist newspapers celebrating this wonderful harvest. So you have peasants resting nicely, and the crops that they have gathered would be somewhere there. Except that in this case, these crops were a bunch of skulls and bones. So, and what struck me was that this photograph was not commented on. It was not picked up by people anywhere.
These harvests concerned all the camps: Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek, as well as Auschwitz and other killing grounds.
Anywhere there was, in fact, a mass execution, even there would be an effort to sort of dig. But there were big excavations going on, and the population from all over the area would be involved.
There were rumors that the Jews killed had diamonds with them that they'd been buried with. So every night, hundreds of peasants came out to dig in search of the gold and diamonds the Jews might have hidden.
And this is something that went on for years, would go on and dig through ashes and remnants and to try to find some valuables.
This Jews' gold was anti-Semitic stereotyping. They thought all Jews had gold.
There are a lot of myths and stereotypes in Polish society. One of them is that all Jews are rich, and it's a myth that's still very much alive today.
This myth of Jewish gold is something I think that still has a life among the peasantry, whether in Poland or in Eastern Europe, further on Ukraine and so forth. But this was a very strongly held belief. This led during the war to just very often to killings of Jews.
It was a fantasy, but it was part of a syndrome. It was part of a way of thinking about Jews as a commodity, as an object. You buy, you sell Jews. You take their property, you buy, you sell their property. Dead Jews, gold, it's all the same.
More than 250,000 Jews lived in displaced persons camps in Germany, Austria, and Italy. Most of them were former concentration camps. As soon as they were freed, survivors started searching for members of their family. Public radio broadcasts and newspapers gave out lists of survivors and their whereabouts. The Allies were prepared to repatriate these displaced Jews to their countries of origin, but many of them refused.
The war stopped, but for the Jews, the suffering, the dying, the grief continued. The persecution and the genocide, while it may have stopped on the 8th of May 1945, continued to have terrible effects on all of their lives. There were hundreds of thousands of displaced Jewish people. There were Jewish parents trying to find their children. There were orphaned children trying to find their way back to their communities. There were struggles over the children in France, Poland, Netherlands who'd been given to Christian families. There were tens of thousands of Jews behind barbed wire. There were more Jews behind barbed wire in the displaced persons camps in Germany and Austria, in the camps run by the British and in Palestine, more Jews behind barbed wire than in 1936 and 1937. And these Jews were miserable. They had no idea what their future was, where they would go.
Jews were running away from Poland. They were going primarily to displaced DP camps in Germany, strange enough, to seek safety in Germany. You were a Jew immediately after the war. But they were running away from Poland, not knowing exactly where to go, but they were afraid to stay in Poland. More than 90% of Polish Jews perished during the war. So there are very few survivors that are coming back. And those few survivors who go to their native villages and looking and trying to find the members of their family or in providing some material help because they were all destitute.
When the Germans deported the Jews, they stripped them of everything they owned. Then they took them off and killed them. So their houses and workshops stayed empty. And little by little, they were taken over by the locals.
People waited for the Jews to be deported from a little town or a shtetl to go and plunder their apartments.
It was a kind of reflex. The locals moved into the apartments the Jews had been living in, and they took over their workshops.
The Jews usually never came home. They knew there was no point, that people would just advise them to leave again.
A Jewish survivor coming back into their home town or village and being met by people they knew very well, because in these villages they may have not liked each other, but they knew each other and were on first-name basis. And precisely with a question like this, so what, you survived?
No one came out to welcome them. Nobody expected them to survive the camps. They weren't really supposed to come home.
And then they are told that they should, if they have people who are friendly to them that they should leave very quickly because their life is in danger. And many who didn't do so and who wanted to take care of in some way of their property or look for some property or look for relatives have been killed in just episodes that were dispersed all over Poland.
Many of them were killed because people were afraid they'd want their property back or their houses.
The Jews preferred to gather in the big cities where there were more of them. So they settled in the urban centers up until the Kielce pogrom of 46.
Mord kielecki wstrząsnął sumieniem świata. Ulicami przeszedł kondukt żałobny z 40 trumnami ofiar straszliwego pogromu. Wymordowano bez litości starców, kobiety i dzieci, dlatego jedynie, że byli Żydami. Te kobiety przeszły przez gehennę obozów niemieckich i dziś w zaraniu odrodzonej wolności straciły swoich najbliższych. Straciły ich z rąk ludzi, którzy mienią się Polakami. Nie możemy zrzucić z siebie odpowiedzialności za tę zbrodnię, która rzuciła cień na dobre imię Polski.
The pogrom in Kielce in 1946 was triggered, yes, by this canard of ritual murder. In other words, of a Christian child being allegedly abducted by Jews and then killed in order to take blood. In the original version, in the medieval original version, it's associated with Pesach and with production of matzah. But this was July, not Easter time, if you will. Actually, there was a kind of a modified version of this blood libel theme that was functioning in Polish society at the time, namely that Jews who came back from camps or who lived through the war under severe oppression, that they were weakened physically and that they were using the blood of Polish children in order, as vitamins, so to speak, in order to fortify themselves. So that was a kind of rumor that was circulating. The Jewish community, or what remained, was deeply worried about it and approached the bishops with a request to speak up on this issue before actually the Kielce pogrom has happened. And bishops refused to do so. They didn't take the stand, announcing officially that this is nonsense. It was like Lynch in the sense that there is a public that observes what's going on and approves what's going on when they took place. These rumors started circulating very early on in many places in Poland. A group of individuals are telling to someone that they encounter in the street and who was driving a truck, listen, we have a few Jews that we want to kill, can you give us a lift? And the fellow says, okay, jump in, as if it was the most simple and natural thing to do. In fact, in response to such rumors of Christian children that have disappeared, there were pogrom-like events in several places in Poland at the time. And again, it's just the tip of the iceberg. There were huge crowds were involved in it, and the number of people that had been killed is also staggering. It's over 40 just in Kielce itself, but then another 40 at least in little villages around, particularly along the railroad tracks, as trains were leaving Kielce. People from these trains would sort of scream to people on stations that were along the route of the train that Jews were murdering Polish Christian children in Kielce, and immediately at the stations over there or on the trains themselves, the same, again, local people or people who were present there would gang up against the Jews and kill scores of them.
Na cmentarzu żydowskim w Łodzi jest grup, rzeczywiście grup.
You can see in the cemetery of Lodz the graves of 4 young Jews who were murdered on the road to Krakow.
I zostali zamordowani. Było to w 1946 roku, w kwietniu 1946.
It was April 1946, at pretty much the same time as the Kielce pogrom.
Zdarzył się pogrom w Kielcach.
This is something that the Catholic Church should have intervened and responded to, and it didn't.
Pogrom w Kielcach i wydarzenia, inne wydarzenia.
The Kielce pogrom was a determining factor in the decision of the majority of Jews who'd survived the Holocaust to leave Poland.
Holocaust postanowiło opuścić Polskę.
Around 150 to 200,000. Half of all the Jews that survived have run away. Within 3 months.
They concluded it was dangerous to live in Poland, and they left.
So there were no more Jews. The Jews were no longer living in a country were full of Jews before the war. It was all obfuscated and obliterated. You know, if it was enough to go to Auschwitz museum, it was very difficult to find the word Jew.
Auschwitz was seen as the place where Poles were martyred. There was a sort of veil drawn over the murder of the Jews. The Jews got lost in the victim count and in the immensity of the crime.
You really had to have a magnifying glass to find the word Jew anywhere.
At the camp, we used to sort out people's property, the things they'd left behind, suitcases, a lot of handbags. One day in a bag, I found some photos of my mother and all her papers. I said to my workmate, "Look, it's my mother's bag." "Yes," he replied, "she's in the sky." I didn't know what he meant, in the sky. I just repeated, "It's my mother's." I was naive.